just going to start recording the event now. So hi everybody, and thanks ever so much for joining this afternoon. It's really lovely being here as part of the Wolverhampton Literature Festival. So thanks ever so much to Georgina and Phil, just behind the scenes, and everyone else who's been putting all this together. So first of all, you'll notice that I'm not Sebastian Gruss as advertised. So sadly, he's been sick. So I'm another member of the team, and I'll be hosting the event today. I'm Elizabeth Durnley, and I'm one of the researchers on the Big Book Review project at the University of Wolverhampton. So for this afternoon, I'm really happy to be here with two writers, Dr. Lisa Blower, who is a short story writer and novelist. She's originally from Stoke and Trent, and her most recent novel, Pondweed, takes readers on a road trip from Stoke and Trent to Wales. And she's also published in the Common People Anthology of Working Class Writers, edited by Kit Duval. And Lisa's also senior lecturer in creative and professional writing at the University of Wolverhampton. And she will in fact be talking about some of her work there as well. So Jan Carson is a writer and community arts facilitator from Northern Ireland, originally from Ballymena in County Antrim, and now based in Belfast. So her novel, The Firestarters, is set in modern day Belfast, and it won the EU Prize for Literature here for Ireland in 2019. And her most recent novel, The Raptures, which came out last month, is set in a rural community in County Antrim. So I'm really, really happy to have both of them here today. So thanks ever so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So just a bit about the structure of this afternoon. I'm going to start off by saying a little bit about the Big Book Review project and the research we're doing, and also how you can get involved in the project. So I really hope that you'll do that. And then I'll have a conversation with Lisa and Jan, and each of them are also going to read a little bit of their work. And we'll also have a space for questions at the end. You can either type in your questions in the chat, or you can ask them with voice if you prefer. But also, if you've got any comments and questions as we go through, do please drop them into the chat as well as the afternoon goes on. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And here we are. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see that. So the Big Book Review is part of a project at the University of Wolverhampton, which is asking questions about how the canon of English literature was formed. So these are the books, obviously, that are generally agreed to be good, important, and worth studying, and thinking about who makes the decisions about, what these books actually are. So what's part of the canon, what gets left out, and as readers, how do we make decisions about the books that we read? How do we choose what to read next? How do we decide what makes a quote-unquote good book? So a vital part of this research is mapping these decisions across the UK. And this is where you come in, we hope. So we're running a large-scale survey called the Big Book Review. So this is asking people for their opinions about novels published in the last 6 years, books people have read, books people haven't read. You still tell us what you think about books that you haven't actually read yet. And of course, the more people who take part, the more accurate a picture we're going to be able to build up of who's reading what, where, and what people really think about the books that they're choosing. So we'd really love it if you could take the survey. So I will pop it in the chat at the end. So yeah, please do take the Big Book Review and add your thoughts. So the project that we're doing brings together literary studies and computational linguistics. So once we've got people's thoughts about novels, we're cross-referencing this with some computational analysis of the novels themselves. So thinking about how people's subjective opinions about books compare with what's actually going on in the text. So are there certain stylistic traits that tally with what we think makes a good book? So here are just some of the things that we've been looking at in our corpus of text, things like document length, vocabulary density, the average number of words in a sentence, readability, the most frequent words that are used, any distinctive words that are used. So there's lots of different things that we can look at using this analysis. So some of our earlier work has been done with BBC Arts in their project, The Novels That Shaped Our World. So this asks people for their opinions on different categories of novels, so things like adventure novels, romance novels, novels about class and society. And we've already been crunching some of this data, and it's yielded quite interesting results about how people's preferences break down by things like gender, like age, and also geographical location. Obviously, today we're talking about regionality and who's reading what where. So it's quite interesting to look at what's been going on in the novels that shaped our world. So one quite interesting thing that we found out is that there do seem to be some variance in reading preferences depending on where people live in the UK. So, for instance, in southwest England, we've seen quite a lot of interest in seafaring novels, things like Master and Commander. In northern England, Jane Eyre is the most popular novel by far that people have recommended. I mean, clearly it's set there, so maybe it's not surprising. But there are other things that maybe aren't quite as straightforward. So in Northern Ireland, for instance, we've noticed that there are different patterns in terms of the adventure novels that people have been recommending and rating. For instance, they didn't rate Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter nearly as highly as readers in other parts of the UK, but they were interested in Robinson Crusoe and the Jungle Book. So again, I'm not entirely sure why these ones particularly, but it's interesting to see what's coming out. So we actually at the moment don't have anything specific about preferences in the Midlands. So whether this is because there aren't specific preferences there, we just haven't got that data yet. But again, it's interesting starting to just draw some of this out and see what we've got. So again, once we've got all the data for the reader, the big book review, it'll be really interesting to sort of add this to the mix as well. So we've got other things that have been coming out about what people think of as a quote unquote literary novel. And, again, is this based in anything in particular? Is it a sort of hunch people have about books? Is it based in something more concrete? So one of the things that's started to come out as well is how people think about books that talk about emotions. So we've been looking at the class and society corpus. So there's 10 novels, including things like Nell Dunn's Poor Cow, Dickens' Our Mutual Friend, got Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea, and there's quite a lot of variation in the way that they talk about emotions. And one of the things that's been coming out is people seem to rate novels as less literary or sort of less prestigious in some way if they do talk about these emotions, which again is interesting. Is it somehow more literary not to? So that the big sort of purple swoopy line that you can see is people talking about love. So that comes up a lot in Nell Dunn's Poor Cow, somewhat in Steinbeck, much less so in Ishiguro, which is about a sort of very emotionally buttoned up set of characters. So again, seeing what comes out is quite interesting. And another thing that's emerging from the data and something that we're doing some work on is looking at novels' use of dialect. Dialect and slang and swearing, how does this affect the way people understand text, seeing them as literary or not literary? And also how these used to anchor places, text to places. How do readers engage with them? Is that mean that they're associating with place because of the language? So again, here we've cross-referenced the corpus of text and class and society with Jan Carson and Lisa Blair's novels. So we've got Lisa's Pondweed and Sitting Ducks and Jan Carson's The Firestarters and The Raptures. So the most commonly word used in the category is we, which appears a lot in Jan Carson's work. We also see it in Muriel Sparks, The Primary Stream Brodie, and Egypt we've got coming up in Jan Carson, also in Cannery Row. So we've got that comparison. And you can see, of course, also how different novelists have used swearing. So this corpus, some words using some variant of fuck can be seen most commonly in Lisa Blair's Sitting Ducks, but also quite a lot, in Nell Dunn's Poor Cow. So it's interesting sort of mapping that as well. But none of these are the most commonly words used in Blower and Carson's work. So we've also done a couple of word clouds. You can see the words that come up the most in your work. So Jan, this is vocabulary in the Raptures. So we can see Hannah, the main character, obviously comes up a lot. I think we do have we've got children, like, so it mixed mostly names. But again, it's just interesting seeing what words come up. And Lisa, we did the same for Sitting Ducks and Pondweed. So again, it's character names to a certain extent, and yes, we can sort of see the spread of language, this and that as well. So I'm really looking forward to digging into these books and their writing with Jan and Lisa. But just before we get onto that, I wanted to do a little quiz with the audience. So because we're thinking about vocabulary and how that ties in with place and dialect, Lisa and Jan have both sent me some words and expressions from the Staffordshire Potteries region and from Ulster Scots, and I wanted to see how many people who knew these. This is the first one. So if you want to just type in the chat what you understand this phrase to mean, and again, this phrase might be interpreted differently in different regions as well. So it'll be really interesting to see what I'm going to get the chat up as well, so I can see what people are adding. So first of all, pottery sayings, it's gone dark over Bill's mother's. Does this mean the news looks depressing? Looks like it's going to rain? Things are looking bad for someone? Or it's nearly night time? So we've got some B's, an A, a C. We've got a mixture. Okay. C. Yeah, getting a spread of results. All right. So the answer is B, looks like it's going to rain. So all of you put that you were right. So I'm just going to go to the next one. Okay, another pottery saying firking. Does this mean lurking, having sex, rooting about, or dancing? A couple of C's, any advances in C's? Got a D. People are less sure about this one. Okay, well, those of you who would C, you're right, rooting about. Although actually I looked it up in Urban Dictionary as well, and one definition was in fact lurking on Facebook. So I've no idea if that's an actual thing, or there was literally one person who came up with that. But anyway, Urban Dictionary has a slightly different one. Okay, so now I've got a couple of Ulster Scots words. First one, footbri. Is this footwear, ornaments, foolish behaviour, or small and fiddly? Got a couple of C's, any advances? Okay, well, nobody's got this one, small and fiddly. And then the final one, calirade. Does this mean ditzy and silly, hot, worried, or elderly? Got an A, C, 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 lots of C's. Okay, so we've got one person who was right, ditzy and silly. But yeah, you people who thought worried or elderly, you're all wrong. So great, well, it's, yeah, really interesting to do that. So thanks ever so much to both of you for giving me those words and for everyone for taking part. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so you can see this and Jan a bit more clearly, and let's get on to the discussion. So yeah, I suppose just going back to those words, really thinking about those words and other words that have wound their way into your work. I wanted to talk a bit more broadly about creating this sense of place through language. I mean, is it located in things like dialect words or expressions? What else goes into it, would you say?
Shall I start?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think there are those words, and what really struck me when I have moved closer and closer with each of my books to using more kind of local regional words, and it's the variation. Northern Ireland is a place of 1.7 million people, 100 miles squared, and yet there's about 40 different regional variations in some of these words. So even trying to pin down spellings for them is really, really interesting. So I think there's a richness of language there, and also kind of the etymology of seeing where some of those words come from, like what they borrow from Scots Gaelic, what they borrow from words that have come from Irish. It's really interesting. And the other thing that I think is super interesting is the shape of how people use words. And I think this is possibly even more important than dialect and colloquialisms. There's a shape to the sentence in each region. And it's something I've become more and more aware of as a writer. And I was having a chat to Louise Kennedy, the short story writer, about this a while ago. And we both said, we can hear the rhythm of a sentence, that sometimes you can tell there's a syllable missing there. I need something else to make that sentence flow right. And that's, I think, what it means to be really attuned to how people put words together in a particular region. So we are nightmarish here for statements that are actually questions. For example, you'll have a cup of tea. That's a question, but there's no question mark in that sentence. So I'd be interested to hear what Lisa says, whether it's very different in Stoke and where she's writing about.
No, not at all, actually. I think we do share an awful lot in terms of how people speak and the language that they use. And it is, particularly people in the potteries, they do have a tendency to make words up, or there's a lack of prepositions mainly in a lot of what people say. And it's the intonation as well. It's almost like it goes up with the sentence. I know it's the same, isn't it, down under, with Australians, and that's how you tell the difference between an Australian and a New Zealand accent. But I think, for me as a writer, it all kind of comes back to that symbiotic relationship that people have with place. Because of place, or we're conditioned by place, or we're shaped by place, or we're trying to escape it, or we're a product of it. And I think that's kind of more of a deeper proposition than the use of the accent or the dialect itself.
Yeah.
But it's the trick, I think, really, as a writer, is how to make it accessible on the page. And I rather think there is possibly a wider appetite or an acceptance of that accent from the Northern Irish point of view, most certainly. And if you look at Scottish fiction as well, whereas if you look at a piece of work that is set in England, it feels like it's far more binary. There's a Southern accent and a Northern accent. do you know what I mean? And like you were saying, Jan, those pockets that you have in that really small region are almost kind of ignored. And then when they do appear, they're almost like an anomaly.
No, that's really fascinating. I suppose as well, just thinking about the orthography of them as well. This idea that are you supposed to spell? How are you supposed to spell words? Because I'm from Yorkshire. I don't sound it, but these days. But sort of growing up, and I would read things. Of course, we're reading it in Yorkshire accent. So it's
I think that's the difference, isn't it? If I read my work, I will get people that will come up to me and say, I get it now because I can hear it. Do you know what I mean, John? I mean, I'm sure you get that same thing.
And we got it a lot with Anna Burns' Milkman, because a lot of people struggled with that as a piece on the page. But whenever they listened to it in an audiobook, or they heard Anna read a piece of it, they were like, oh, I totally get it. I think one of the weird things for me is almost fixing your kind of your dictionary of words, because there comes a point in your life as a writer. It was so strange seeing that graph you put up, Elizabeth, how many times I use we and how much swearing is doing.
How much swearing. Don't tell my mum.
Definitely don't tell my mother. But you realize that you're going to use a word like wean for children, and you're going to use it over and over and over, and you need to pick a spelling of it, and that will be your spelling of it for the rest of your writing career. I think that's quite strange, that I sometimes have to refer back and go, what is my fixed spelling of use? Because we say the plural of you a lot. So I spell it Y-O-U-S-E, but there are other Northern Irish writers that spell it without the E.
Right.
I'm surprised actually that duck didn't feature a lot more, because obviously duck is that term of endearment. Everyone's up Annely Duck. And and when, particularly from when I kind of writing those sort of working class matriarchs, duck is really every other word, and I was quite surprised not to have seen that.
That's not
but it's edited out quite a bit, I must admit. It was edited out quite a bit because after a while, editors kind of said to me, do people really use duck this often? And I was like, oh God, yeah. And also people's names. That was the other thing. They do talk to you. So as they'd be talking, they go, what do you think, Jan? Do you not think this, Jan? What do you think? And that's how your name had been mentioned quite a lot. And I've had editors say, people don't use people's names this often.
But yeah, they
do in Stoke.
Just thinking about who you're writing for as well. I mean, if there's, it can be pinned down, when writing, is it are you sort of explaining who's the audience, I guess, or is there any one audience? Is it sort of, I mean, if you read things about one's own place, and it's there's recognition, but also sort of explaining that for people who are not from that place, from a different place. So it can be for both.
I got really cross about this, Elizabeth, because I've had editors in the past that have been like, calirade, nobody will know what calirade is, you should put a footnote in or change that.
Right.
And I began to realize that writers from other places don't do that. Our Daddy Roy is not explaining all of the Indian terms that she's using, or the foods or the place names. So why should I from Northern Ireland have to do that? And I know I've already referenced her here today, but Milkman was a huge text for us in those terms, because it's unapologetically Northern Irish in the language, and it doesn't explain itself. It just kind of goes, I challenge you as a reader to step up to this. That's the kind of reading experience I enjoy as a reader. So why would we patronize our readers with explaining terms?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you're right, actually, because for me, it's how much you're asking the reader to be challenged and actually make hard. It's like if it becomes hard work. Do you know what I mean? If it feels hard work to understand that voice from the outset, you might lose your reader. Or at least that's the kind of feedback I've had in the past. One of the things with Sitting Ducks was, could you rewrite this from the little girl's point of view, because that would make the politics more palatable? And I was no, because it's not her story. But you can see, you can probably see why they're asking for it, because they feel that that voice would be stronger and resonate, and people would relate to it a lot more than they would a 30-something bloke out of work, illiterate, trying to keep his family together and trying to keep their home, still living with his mother, very influenced by the mother. Do you know what I mean? And so there's all these kind of factors that influence the voice, but to not stay true to that voice just for the sake of making it a little bit more accessible, that's the argument, isn't it? And where you want to be with a writer, do you stay true to it, or do you go with what an editor suggests? I don't know. Have you had that, Jan? Have you had a similar experience?
Particularly in translating to an American market.
Like
what I find really strange is like the Firestarters has been translated into 12 different languages, and the Germans and the Spanish and the French are all quite happy to grapple with local colloquialisms translated into different languages, but American readers seem to want the English terms explained for them. I guess I've just got a wee bit angry about it, and a bit kind of staunch, and just what I think I've read your work as well, Lisa, and I think you do this really well. We drop words into sentences in context that you can kind of work out what it's meant, and if not, there's this thing called the internet, and you can Google stuff and then you learn something. And isn't that a great thing, to learn a word you didn't know before? So I'm just not doing it anymore. Like it or lump it, I'm using the local terms.
I know you do feel a little bit belligerent after a while. There was we had Jen Ashworth was speaking to our students a couple of months ago, and she said exactly the same thing. I think she'd had a review where they said, I hope Jen Ashworth no longer writes about Lancashire or Preston. So the next book she delivered was about Preston. Because she said, no, you're not going to tell, kind of not dictate what I want to write about and what I feel is credible and authentic and true to my voice. So
yeah, and I'd also think, sorry, we've gone off wildly off topic.
No.
Sorry, yes.
I'm not at all.
One of the reasons I want to do this is because as a kid growing up, reading furiously around the kind of Irish canon of literature, I didn't see those words, those phrases, those kind of stories, idioms, reference points that were local to me. And that's a really disorientating experience. Whereas I just love the idea, like I'm getting loads of feedback at the minute from people reading it in Ballymena and going, oh, that's how I talk. Isn't it great?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you get the same, Lisa. Like that's a lovely thing to pass on.
You do. And I think, I think one of the nicest things that anybody has said to me, that they came up to me at the end of an event, and it was for the short story collection for It's Gone Dark Over Bill's Mothers, and a gentleman came up to me and he said, thank you for writing about my mum. If my mum was here, she would have loved you. And I think she died 20 years ago. But even so, I really took that to heart. I thought that is just lovely. It really is, because we don't represent enough, I think, in terms of people and how they speak, and those little pockets of distinction. They get so sort of squirreled away for this homogenized voice, and it's nice. Or they're the kind of secondary character that walks in, do you know what I mean, and makes a big splurge of language. But to have that protagonist carrying it all the way through, or that narrator, I think it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the questions I was going to come to, really, is just, what representations that you'd had of Northern Ireland and the Midlands in literature growing up. But I guess part of it is that, these voices weren't representing those areas particularly. So, I mean, were there anything? Yeah, go on.
We did have some. So, who were laughing last night with some friends who are writers, like Heaney just dominated the landscape for us as kids. A friend has got a child who's at 16 negotiating GCSEs here, and shock horror, there's no Heaney on the curriculum, and she was like, what's happened to Northern Ireland's like literary curriculum? I'm sure it is there somewhere, but that was mostly the only Northern Irish voice that we had, and it's a wonderful voice, a very rich lyrical voice, but it shouldn't be the only voice. That a white rural male Catholic voice is not the only voice in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't have well, there was only Arnold Bennett. He was writing at the turn of the 20th century, and basically had massive beef with Virginia Woolf. Or she had massive beef, didn't she, with him for his materialist thinking, and the fact that he was just a subserver of place that was churning out novels about the potteries in the same way that Defoe was doing his quest plot. So, and he, there's this, from an academic point of view, and if I ever talk about Bennett from an academic point of view, he's so far removed from that place. He's this observer that's kind of over here, and he's not actually within the place in that kind of fiction that faces inward, and you've got this immersive voice. But it was never on any curriculums. Even in the library, people didn't necessarily champion him. So it's and then of course really there was only Sillitoe, who was Nottingham. Barry Hines, was obviously Yorkshire. Yorkshire seemed to have a little bit more, and of course you've got Lawrence, D.H. Lawrence, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I was just saying, in Yorkshire, I don't know, because I don't feel like we really read any Yorkshire people at school. I mean, even the Brontes, I don't think we did. Remember, I read this book called Brother in the Land, which is basically, imagine there was a nuclear bomb that went off in Britain and it went off in Bradford, and it was just all quite sort of grim and bleak. So yeah, I don't remember seeing, Bradford particularly represented, certainly not positively. So it's
I think a lot of it has to do with what's on a school curriculum, I must admit.
Yeah,
because if
absolutely.
you're not exposed to those kind of writers or that kind of literature, and I mean, centuries ago when I was at school, I just remember 1984, The Crucible, A Streetcar Named Desire, Death of a Salesman. So it was actually more American playwrights that seemed to dominate my English literature. The one book that we did have was Kes, and of course, and I remember reading this and thinking, oh my God. And then of course I did Talking Heads at A level, was just like, I've got to write like this. How do I write like this? But if you're not exposed to it at an early age, I think that's why it comes to us as quite a shock and a challenge, really, because we've not had that from the beginning. We've not been encouraged to look at it from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something we've seen with the data that we're getting, that a lot of people's recommendations, things are studied at school because that's what's familiar. Yeah. So when you think, what's my canon, people's minds automatically just go to that, just because think, well, it was on the school curriculum, therefore it must be,
must be like Jane Eyre.
Exactly. So back to Jane Eyre. How about you, Jan? What else was on your curriculum?
Wuthering Heights, which was a huge influence to me. And I'm just thinking, hearing Lisa talk there and yourself as well, I think sometimes it's who taught you a book as well. And I had an amazing teacher for Wuthering Heights, and it just changed everything for me. Like it made me like, I'll probably lose lots and lots of friends here, but I cannot stand Jane Austen, and we'd had a lot of Jane Austen shoved down our throats, and then along came Emily Bronte, and I was like, wow, this is real emotion, this is not embroidery. And I'm so glad to have had that experience. And the same at undergrad. I did write literature for undergrad at university, and I had a brilliant modernists professor, and because of that, that's the period I still go back to. I love all of that literature because he just brought it alive. So you are really at the whim sometimes of not just what books you cross, but who presents them to you at certain points in your life.
So thinking, I guess, about sort of going back in time a bit, I'd like to hear a bit more about the Raptures now, Jan, if that's okay. Also, it's set in a small town in the 90s in rural Northern Ireland. You grew it yourself, so if you could just say a little bit more about that and creating a place in that.
Yeah, so I'll show you the cover because I think it's my favorite of any of the books I've had so far. The cover is
an amazing cover.
So it's set in 1993 in a fictional small village outside of Ballymena, where I grew up. And if anyone's from Northern Ireland, they can work out very quickly which fictional village it is, but I will just do them the service of not mentioning the name so I don't get run out of it. It's set over the course of a summer and follows a group of 11-year-old children who are about to transition to high school, and a mysterious illness kind of sweeps through the children, and one by one they die, and only Hannah is left, and Hannah's the chief protagonist in the story, and she's really trying to wrestle through. She's from a very conservative kind of Christian background, and she's trying to wrestle through just all of this new information and what it tells her about how she's seen the world up to this point, which was very simplistic and black and white, and suddenly, course of one summer, everything's a lot more complicated. Saying that, it sounds terribly depressing, but it's actually quite a funny book.
Yeah, it is funny. I can attest to that.
My PR person's always like, make sure you say it's not just about dead children. So yeah, that's the Raptures.
Yeah, it's really fantastic. So if people haven't read it yet, I would heartily recommend it.
I also have to explain this because do you guys know what the Rapture is?
I know about a version of it. Tell us.
So the rapture within evangelical Christianity is the period at the end of the world when the kind of born again saved people, they are lifted, they're raptured before the rest of the world has to go through this horrible period of tribulation. And as kids growing up in that world, if you came home from school and there was nobody in the house, you'd be like, oh shit, the raptures have happened and I've been left behind. So there was a real fear, and in America, there's a whole movement that grew up around it, around the kind of left behind. So some people just think it's rapture in terms of kind of emotional rapture, but there's a kind of religious thing to it as well.
So could you possibly read a bit of it for us?
I would love to. I'm going to read about just about a page and a half, and it's just after Ross, the first child, has died. I'm going to read this because it gives you a little kind of idea of the village, the world it's in, but I also think there's a kind of that rhythm of language we've been talking about as well. Ross had only just turned 11. He was still a child, though the thought of girls was already pressing. He'd sometimes go through the K's catalogue for pictures of women in bras and pants. He'd yet to touch a girl himself, had yet to taste coffee or travel anywhere in an aeroplane. He'd been looking forward to Lanzarote. It would have been his first time in a foreign place. Poor Ross, it's never easy going first. There's been no talk of the boys passing yet. It'll be mid-morning before the news spreads. In the houses and farms of Ballylack, people are getting on with their everyday doing. They're feeding the cows and drinking tea, watching the telly and heading to bed. There's no expectation that tomorrow will be much different from today. 93 has been an unremarkable year. The summer's shaping up to be equally forgettable. It's neither hot nor particularly damp. It isn't a World Cup year or one for the Olympics. Majors in Downing Street, Clinton's in the White House. Folks aren't sure what to make of him. Keep an eye on that one. He's got notions, they like to say. There's talk of Clinton wading into the troubles. Word is, he thinks he can sort it out. Let the same fella have a run of it. Better than him have tried and failed. Down south, Ireland win the Eurovision for the umpteenth year in a row. In Your Eyes is the song in question. You'd have a hard time dancing to it, though it's got a catchy hook. Makes a change from the usual earnest shout. Plonk, 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 and words about peace. What are the young ones listening to? Shaggy, Ace of Base, Too Unlimited, feel-good Euro hits. They don't sound half so feel-good, pumping through the tinny speakers of the GAA clubs and community centres where Ulster's youth hang out, dancing, smoking, drinking cheap vodka decanted into Fanta bottles. No limits, we'll reach for the sky, the youngsters sing, fists pumping furiously to the beat, black bomber jackets soaking up their sweat. They go buck mad every time No Limits comes on. It's only a tune to them, not the call to arms it could be. No limits indeed. What a load of bollocks. These kids hail from Aucher, Clocher and Collybaggy. Say it out loud. Collybaggy. You can practically hear the fences. They couldn't be more limited if they tried. Elsewhere in the province, they're still at it, killing each other with bombs and guns. It's the 23rd or 4th summer of this nonsense. Depends on when you started keeping count. Most folks are fed up with the whole thing. They're adamant the killing must stop. There's war in Bosnia and Afghanistan. There's a brutal one winding up in Rwanda. You can't turn on your telly for seeing dead bodies piled everywhere, blood pooling in the gutters, women howling and getting on. The people here are sick of death. This isn't a third world country. This is Britain, or this is Ireland, or both, or neither, or it's its own institution, peculiar as a maiden aunt. Either way, it's a civilised country. It's been a whole 2 years since McDonald's arrived.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
it's the first time I've read that. It's quite fun to read.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it sounds, having sort of been trying to imagine it reading, it's really wonderful hearing in your voice. So thanks so much for that. Also, I love the 90s-ness of it, can I just say as well.
Can I just tell you this really great thing? So the kids in it, No Limits is their theme tune. And we actually had to get in touch with Too Unlimited to get the rights of them. And they were so lovely. They didn't charge us for it. They were like, use away. I think they were dead chuffed to be in a literary fiction novel.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Can I just comment on something actually, Jan, because that was lovely. It was so lovely. But it's this where you kind of set things as well, because you're in Northern Ireland and you've got the troubles, you've got this backcloth. And it's back to that kind of symbiosis, isn't it, as well? Because, I mean, the troubles, it has its own dictionary, doesn't it? And it has its own vocabulary, it has its own language. And, of course, and how it's all linked and affiliated with religion and that kind of separation and division. And do you know what I mean? What you're kind of writing against is almost kind of like a language of its own, isn't it, now? When you think, when we look at it and...
It's funny because it's a language of its own, Lisa, but it's a language that it's very difficult to pin down. Like, I mean, the Firestarters, my last book, really looked at this, like how we use language in Northern Ireland, that every word has different resonance to different people. So that line about this is Britain or Ireland or both or neither, or like,
absolutely,
And that's quite hard to write in when the language itself is slippery all the time, but it's also a
Yeah,
lovely challenge to work with.
yeah. And do you think it'll be more sort of prevalent now with Brexit? Do you know what I mean? Because we're kind of seeing that now filter into writers' work. Do you think that will have more of a resonance in Northern Irish work?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been great for us because it's shone a spotlight on Northern Irish writing, you know, on a really base level. There's been a lot more interest in the writers here in the last 4 years. I wish it was for a different reason, but some of it is that.
Yeah.
I think there's a much bigger interest in philosophical question about Brexit and language, because Brexit and borders here to me are about taking away the nuance. So it's about drawing a line and saying, what side are you on? Are you Irish or British? Are you European or not European? And the joy of the last 20 odd years in Northern Ireland has been Good Friday allowed us to be both.
Yeah.
And everything and neither. And that happened with the language as well.
Yeah.
And I feel this is much more about pick a side and stick to it. So we as writers, I think, have to wrestle with that and struggle against it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just moving from Northern Ireland to the Midlands, Lisa, I want to ask you a bit now about Pondweed.
Okay.
So if you could just tell us a bit about that. And
well, Pondweed is it's a road trip, and it's when two childhood sweethearts reunite. They were next door neighbours. It's actually based on a family story of my great granny Gladys was standing at the bus stop in a little place called Wem, just outside. It's a Shropshire village, very, very small, and she gets talking to this old gentleman, and it turned out to be her childhood sweetheart that she thought she'd lost to World War One. And they were both in their 80s, and he was very unwell, and my granny Gladys had always been in service. And he said, you know, I'm going to have to get somebody in to help me. So she said, oh, well, you know, I'll come and clean for you. 85. And anyway, she ended up moving in with him. And because they didn't want folk talking, they got married. And it's this lovely kind of family story. But I've always been fascinated by this idea of, you know, is what, you know, if what's for you shouldn't, you know, it never passes you by. And is it happenstance? And is there actually this fatalistic one person that you were always supposed to be with? But I also liked this idea. I was right as I came out with the idea. I was commuting to Bangor, spending a lot of time on the A55, following caravans, a lot of pimped up caravans as well. And I started to get this idea of what if they went off with an exhibition of sort of vehicle that had a fish tank in it and a fully stocked bar. But it was also this idea of people who'd gone nowhere. You know, because I think that was something that really defined particularly my grandparents' generation in the potteries. They were born and bred in the potteries. They lived in the potteries until the day they died. And they never went anywhere, never had any passports, never left the country, but were completely contented by that. And it always seemed to me like they were going round in circles in these little districts. And yet, as the generations have kind of progressed, we've all seemed to have become more transient and more adventurous. But my grandparents' generation still look down on us for doing that. You know, oh, aren't you ambitious or wanting? Do you know what I mean? And it's a really interesting line between what is ambition and what is adventure and what is social mobility. And so, yeah, that's what it's all about.
Again, really, really fantastic. And could you read some of it for us?
Yes, I can. Yes, I'd love to. Thank you. I'm going to read from the section where my two protagonists, Ginny and Selwyn, first meet. So picture the scene. Joiners Square, Stoke-on-Trent, circa 1966, the year of the Barclaycard and hovercrafts. We spluttered and strutted under smog on the slag, workers but not earners, walkers but not explorers, side by side and hand to mouth in a wedding ring of terraces, worriting about the weather, to peg out or not to peg out, and what we had left over in the larder for our teas. There were gamblers and grafters in numbers 1 to 10, hoodlums and hairdressers from 11 to 20, then Nora the war hut nurse and Teapot Marge, who'd read your tea leaves for a tanner, but chuck her another and she'd have you think you were going to change the world. Across the way, Tracy Spooner pushing her phantom baby, and always with her mother, wicked Ethel, who'd grow parsley the size of a hedge. We lived in 23 with new neighbours in 24, and no one knows any different, and less is definitely not more. But it's Friday, which means the social club, Babysham, fags and necking, and a codhead for our tea. And we were the lucky ones. We is me, Meg and the bluebird. One mother is a butcher, the other never leaves the house. Don't talk of a father, but believe in miracles and storks. And I'm a sneeze off 16, caring for nothing but boys and petticoats. My hair has never met with scissors, so it's as bushy as a squirrel tail and a weird mushroom grey. I wear it like a cape that hides the unfastened zips or missing buttons on the backs of dresses my mother makes me wear. Woe betide I ever forget that I'm a girl, which have been someone else's and fitted them better. She's a brontosaurus of a woman who casts shadows in the street. And I'm not allowed to call her mother Mum or even Ma. She is only Meg, as if we are roommates. And she calls me Imogen Dare because, God damn it, I will. Yes, I have to pay her board and lodgings, which I do by working in the butcher's with her on weekends. And she even puts the coins in an envelope and gets me to hand it back to her, like we're traders. My other mother says nothing, yet sees everything, drifts from room to room as if on casters, and blends into the wall. A wooden slatted cart filled with wooden ice boxes on a Friday would come down the street, and the fisherman would be looking at me as I'd be looking at the fish, who'd sometimes be looking at me and sometimes not. And when they weren't looking at me, which meant their eyes had been plucked out, then I'd look up to the fisherman and say, no, thank you. Except this one Friday, the fisherman has nothing but kippers and he's trying to get rid of them by offering them at half the price. So this man appears, and Selwyn is a man. Even at 20, he had a face like a barbed wire fence, and he looked too old to be living at home, which he was, our new next door neighbour at number 24. He'd moved here with his mother and been very vague in where they were from. There was something about them both that made you wonder if snow had fallen and frozen solid. Their lives seemed so still. So I was looking at the fish, which were looking at me, and also at the fisherman who was looking at me, along with this other man being Selwyn, being our next door neighbour in number 24. And Selwyn asks the fisherman for how far the fish have travelled because he's not yet found a pond. And he doesn't talk like us, not at all, but with a Welsh lilt that makes the fisherman ask him what he's doing round here. Selwyn says something about settling his old dear, and he'd be much obliged if the fisherman knew of any ponds, lakes or streams nearby. Angler, are you? The fisherman goes, and Selwyn says, I'm not fishing, no, I'm interested in the weeds and what's submerged. Except to start to realise that Selwyn's not telling any of this to the fisherman, but to me. He can't stop looking at me as if he's shocked by the look of me. So I look back at him and almost straight in the eye because I've got that tall, and he says, do you mind all those bones in kippers? Because if it's not what you want, you mustn't let him persuade you. You keep to what you want. And I just keep looking at him because there's something familiar about him, something I can't put my finger on, because we've met, haven't we? I wanted to say, you and me, somewhere, somehow, we've been together. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. It's really great. Yeah, it's again, Ginny's voice. It's just wonderful hearing it read aloud.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Do you think, Lisa, do you go broader accent wise when you're reading that than your normal speaking voice?
Yeah. I do. It's funny, isn't it? If I ever speak to any of my relatives in Stoke, I really drop back into it. And if I've had a drink, I become more Stoke. The more wine, the more Stoke I become. But I notice it when I read it. I read more in a Potteries accent, and I notice that sometimes I really drop my vowels.
Yeah, I could hear that.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
No, it's great. Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to open it up now to any questions, if anybody might have any for Lisa or for Jan, or if you want to know more about the project. So if you've got anything you want to ask them, just pop it in the chat, or indeed feel free to switch your microphone on and ask with your voice as well. I've got from Margaret, who says, Jan, you said this is the easiest and hardest book you've written. Was writing about the community you grew up in the hard part, and how did you get over any reluctance about that?
It's a good question. Yeah, it was the easiest book to write in terms of like, this is the world that I know inside out. It's how I grew up. So, you know, probably the same as Lisa, you just switch on that little bit of you that still speaks like that when you've had a drink, and you just go for it. So it was easy to write in that sense. But the thing I find hard is, and I'd be interested to hear what Lisa says about this, because having read your novel, you know, it's a warts and all kind of take on it, as is the Raptures. And I wanted to try and make sure that I didn't write something that just was a vent for all my bitterness, because it was quite a difficult environment to grow up in. I wanted something nuanced that gave both the positives of growing up kind of rural conservative Presbyterian and some of the more difficult parts, and that took me a long time. I've been writing this novel for 15 years without being able to take the bitterness out of it until very recently. Did you have some of that going back to writing about Stoke?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've written this novel with more of a fondness for Stoke-on-Trent than I did with with Sitting Ducks. I think Sitting Ducks was quite harsh and came from quite a harsh place. And I think over the years, I mean, I don't live in Stoke-on-Trent anymore, and I haven't done for a number of years, but it does still have this formative impact upon my writing, and I don't quite know why. And I think as a writer, I'm constantly kind of negotiating why every time I come up with a new story idea, it comes to me in a Stoke accent. You know, why is it that even if my characters are living somewhere else, they come from Stoke? And I don't know what it is about the place that I feel really drawn to, whether or not it's because nobody's been writing about it, whether or not it's because it has this rich tapestry, whether or not it's because I think it's had a really rough deal over the years. And it should be more of a city that is taken seriously. Do you know what I mean? And because it's always been this place of 6 towns, and I think that's the other thing as well that really fascinates me about it. It's not a place that has a dead centre. Is it Hanley or is it Stoke? You know, and the 6 towns obviously used to be delineated by the potteries that was producing at the time, and with all of that gone now, what does what do those 6 towns really mean? And it's just, I just find it fascinating as a place to write about.
I think one of the things that really helped me, it was an interview that George Saunders did a long time ago about writing critically about things, where he talked about when you're writing critically about a place or a community or a situation, you always have to begin by asking, how much am I complicit within this problem? So for him, it was writing about kind of Trump's America. Before you start critiquing it, you have to go, how much have I contributed to the problem? And I guess whenever I'm writing about home or Northern Ireland, I always have to place myself in it. I don't feel like I'm on the edge looking at it. Part of the reason that this place is a mess, I'm part of that. I'm a 42-year-old woman. Tomorrow is my birthday in the morning, and that'll be 24 years I've been a voter with an ability to change this place. And so the fact that it's not entirely changed is partially down to me. And I don't mean that you beat yourself up about that, but it's interesting as an artist to place yourself in the thing that you're criticizing, as well as being objective about it.
Do you not find though that it comes from a point of, rather than bitterness, but frustration, in the sense that I mean, I often feel like I can't do anything about stuff, but I can write about it. I can highlight this as an issue. And I find that quite fascinating, because I then get pigeonholed as this working class writer, when actually I'm highlighting an issue that's really important, that is going on right now, and I've written a story about it. And I always remember being at a festival and reading Abdul, which is a story of a social worker picking up an asylum seeker, and just this journey in the car taking them to the YMCA in Stoke-on-Trent. And I was really fascinated. It was a story in the newspaper. I was fascinated by the language barriers actually between two people, and being in this car for 4 hours. And I came off stage, and it was Ed Miliband was there, and he came over to me, and the first thing he said was, where did you get your information from? And I said, well, it's a story, isn't it? It was from the newspaper. And I did a bit of research. And but isn't it fascinating that, sometimes you can touch a nerve, and that means I'm quite pleased when I do that.
And I think as well, like, you're constantly asking it, what is our role as writers? Like, I'm desperately frustrated this week because it looks like Stormont's going to collapse again. And should I just jack it all in and become a politician, or continue writing about it? And I think we were all talking last night. There was a lot of us writers out and getting angry. What are we going to do about Northern Ireland? And one of the things that really struck me was, we've talked about it today already, we didn't have any stories about our world growing up. So there was nothing to rally behind. And I remember really clearly studying To Kill a Mockingbird and going, isn't racial injustice awful? We would always stand up and do the right thing. And then a bunch of girls from our class went down to the bus station and beat up the Catholic girls from the Catholic school. And the dots weren't joined. They weren't going, bad stuff that happens in America is similar to bad stuff that happens here, because we didn't have stories about what was happening on our doorstep. So perhaps that is some of our role as artists, to join up the dots. So we've gone off, and this is meant to be about language, and we've gone.
No, it is all part of the same thing.
It is, isn't it? It is, because I think that's the thing. We are, language always has a context, and language belongs. It's kind of what I was saying in the beginning. It has this symbiosis with its people, and the stories we tell each other, the stories we tell of ourselves, in terms of the history of the people of that place as well. So it all kind of links into language, because it's about the subjects we write about, and how we do it, and how true we are to those voices. So
absolutely. Got a question in the chat from Bass, who's sort of following up on some things we've already talked about. He said, is there any pressure from agents, publishers, not to use dialect that alienates readers, not from a certain place? And is there perhaps sort of unconscious self-censorship, or the opposite?
Like I said before, I've had it in the past, and I now have the best editor in the world and the best agent in the world, and they know not to push me around. To the extent there was a really funny thing in the Raptures. We had, do you remember what an OHP is? An overhead projector.
So
I had it down originally as they were singing choruses of the OHP. And my editor is so intent in making me be okay. She went and Googled OHPs and found this weird religious sect of Irish evangelicalism that was OHP. And she's like, no, we can totally go with this. And I was like, Kate, it's just an overhead projector. So it was lovely that they're actually really supportive and intent and allowing me to use those words now.
I likewise, really. I think it's got better. I think it's got better, and my agent's just always been really supportive of it from the beginning. I think if there is one thing to say, I find that if I write in dialect in a short story, it seems to be more acceptable than if I write in the novel. Do you know what I mean? I think it's, people seem to like that bite-sized, digestible chunk of language. But if it's in a long-winded novel, they find, well, it's got to, how we keep maintaining it, and maybe we can break away from it and find a way to break that narrative up. But thank God for Anna Burns, who came along for me, and I just was like, yes, this is exactly what I've been talking about for years. So
Fantastic. Well, we've come round to half past, so I think we'll wrap things up here. So thanks both of you so much for taking part in this. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and thanks to everybody who's come along. And I'm just going to pop in the chat finally, survey bigbookraeview.co.uk. So this is the survey that we're talking about. And yeah, please, if you want to do that, that would be great. But yeah, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and very, very happy birthday, Jan, for tomorrow.
Thank you.
And
Happy birthday, Jan. Yeah.
bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Okay, I think I got there in the end.